It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the LG UltraGear 24GQ50F or 24GQ50F-B if you want to be a little bit more complete. The B at the end there just means it has a mainly black back. As usual for a video, remember that what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, the processing done by YouTube, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. So in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor would look like in person. This video review really accompanies a more detailed written review, which covers some aspects that this video won't. Goes into more technical details, so if you like that side of things or you want to learn a bit more about the monitor, be sure to check that out. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. And liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, also a nice way of showing your support. This monitor uses a 23.8-inch VA panel from AU Optronics, and that has a full HD resolution, 1920 by 1080 or 1080p if you prefer. So this is very limited in terms of productivity, desktop real estate, that kind of thing. Multitasking as I'm trying to do here, yeah, not really great with this kind of resolution. The pixel density is, well, it's okay because it's not particularly large screen, but it's not particularly strong in that respect either. So it isn't like a 27-inch QHD model, 2560 by 1440 or 1440p. It's a bit lower than that. Doesn't quite have the same clarity and sharpness as that, but it's more similar to a 32-inch or so QHD model, so it's not terrible in terms of its pixel density. Many of you will be very familiar with this resolution anyway. It is a common resolution. It's been a resolution we've had for quite a while on screens of this kind of size, and it remains a popular choice for screens of this size. And it makes it easier to get good frame rates, to make good use of the refresh rate, which in this case is 165 Hz, and I'll be exploring all of that, the responsiveness, a little bit later on. Sometimes when I cover VA models, I'll have to talk a little bit about subpixel structure because they can have some issues that can affect text clarity and fine edge clarity, such as split subpixel rendering, partial illumination, that kind of thing. This model doesn't have anything like that, any kind of issues in that respect. It has normal RGB subpixels with a standard arrangement, just as you'd hope to see. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has pretty basic design, lots of matte black plastic from the front, plastic penguin foot stand design with a plastic neck as well, matte plastic bottom bezel. This monitor has limited ergonomics. You can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit. Exact adjustability is given in the written review, but you can't adjust the height, you can't swivel it, and you can't pivot the screen. In terms of how solid it feels though, there isn't excessive wobble to the screen if you tap it or anything like that, so it's pretty firmly held in place. It feels quite decent particularly for a budget monitor. The top and side bezels have the dual stage bezel design, which means you've got a panel border which is flush with the rest of the screen, and you can't really see it when the screen's switched off or can't clearly see it. It's clearer when the monitor's displaying an image, it's switched on. And there is a slim hard plastic outer component as well to the bezel. Even with both components, it remains pretty slim, the bezels. And again, there are exact measurements in the written review. Speaking of measurements, I also measure, for example, the depth of the monitor. So it has quite a shallow stand design. So if you don't have a particularly deep desk, this is quite useful. It's a compact monitor. You can get a bit of distance between your eyes and the screen if you want to. The main feature from the front is the screen itself. And this has what I would classify as a light, or perhaps using my classification system, I'd put it somewhere between medium and light. So perhaps relatively light. But really, I think it's a bit closer to the light end than the medium end, so let's just go for light. This is an entirely subjective classification system, and what I mean by this is I look at the interaction of light when the monitor is displaying very dark content in particular, or when it's switched off. I also look at the layering of the screen, so how aware you are of the screen surface as a sort of layer in front of the image when the screen is switched on, and that kind of thing. So again, it's very subjective, and I just compare to other models I've used. And I talk a little bit more about how that affects the image when it's switched on shortly, but when it's switched off, or just in general, the general reflection and glare characteristics, if you like, of the screen, it does handle glare well. So this room isn't super bright or anything like that. There's a bit of natural light in the room. I've also got some LED lighting set to a cool colour temperature. So it simulates a sort of moderately bright day, I guess. And you can sometimes see some slightly sharper glare patches. I wouldn't really call it reflection. They're not super sharp glare patches, but depending on your lighting conditions, you might notice that a little bit. Stronger matte screen surfaces would diffuse this more heavily, so you'd get a hazing of the screen, which does affect the image when it's switched on. And you do get some of that here as well, but really, irrespective of the screen surface that the monitor has, you would ideally avoid strong direct light striking the screen surface, and you would ideally avoid a very bright room. But because this isn't a super light screen surface, and it certainly isn't glossy, it is more forgiving if you happen to be sitting in quite a bright room. At the rear, it's plastic, but there are various different textures used. So there's a hexagonal region in the middle, which has a plain matte black plastic used. That's also used lower down. It's used for the stand as well. Further up, it has a glossy finish to the plastic, but it's textured. So it has a little bit of a kind of scratchy feel, if you like. So that doesn't attract fingerprints the same as some smooth glossy plastics would. That's just used for the LG UltraGear logo at the top there. The stand attaches lower down. You screw it in, and you can see that there are also some visa holes above that. They're 75 by 75mm visa holes, so a bit of a more compact pattern than the 100 by 100mm, which is more standard. But most mounting solutions for alternative mounting, if you're using these, they will include both patterns, but do check. The ports are located in a recessed area to the right of that stand attachment point. The two HDMI 1.4 ports, there's DisplayPort 1.2A, there is a 3.5mm headphone jack, and there is a DC power input. So this monitor does have an external power brick. It's a pretty compact one though, it doesn't take up a huge amount of space on the floor or anything like that. In terms of the capabilities of the ports, you've got the full HD resolution 1920 by 1080 via HDMI and DisplayPort, maximum of 165Hz via DisplayPort, maximum of 144Hz via HDMI. You can also use adaptive sync via HDMI and DisplayPort. That would include AMD FreeSync Premium via HDMI and DisplayPort, or it would include NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort only. And if you've got an Intel system, you should be able to use adaptive sync on that as well. And because AMD FreeSync is supported via HDMI, you could use that on games consoles such as the Xbox Series X and S as well. Just a few final points. There's the OSD control joystick that's explored in the OSD video. That's a separate video on the channel. And there's a K-slot, Kensington lock slot as well at the bottom. And you might be able to see that there is this sort of fingerprint magnet glossy black plastic with a smooth texture. That goes all around the monitor, so it's not just at the bottom, it's at the sides as well and the top. I'm not a great fan of this particular material, but there's only a relatively small amount of that on this model, so that's not too bad. I'm now going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor, and to start off I've got my very scientific PCM Black Crush test up. Ignore the background there, looking very overexposed. I've had to adjust the camera in a specific way to try and show this. It's quite difficult to show on the camera. But what this window here shows, it has the letters PCM written in dark grey against a black background. It's a very dark grey against a black background. And towards the centre of the screen, or it's a bit above centre, how I've got the camera mounted at the moment, and it depends on your eye position. But it's the section of the screen that's in line with your eyes or the camera. That will be more blended, and that's because the perceived gamma for these dark shades is increased there. So things blend together more, they sort of blend into a black mass. Whereas lower down the screen towards the side edges, or depending on your viewing position, it could be a bit towards the top of the screen, the visibility is improved, the perceived gamma is lower there, so things are more visible, darker shades are lighter than they should be. You can see this a little bit if I move the window down. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. Again, this doesn't always come across very well on the video, on the camera, but maybe you can see that PCM is a bit more visible there than a bit higher up. Towards the sides of the screen you can see that a bit as well. Black Crush is something which affects all VA models to a degree. This one isn't too bad in this respect, so that's another reason these shifts aren't super easy to capture in this particular case, because they aren't extreme shifts, but your darker content does still look a bit more blended for the area of the screen directly in line with your eyes versus the peripheral regions. I'm now going to continue my assessment of contrast using Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This monitor's VA panel has contrast as its main strength really. The model has a specified static contrast of 3000 to 1, and I recorded very close to that. So using my test settings, which I'm using at the moment and I use for most of the review, I measured 2800 to 1. I did have to make some colour channel adjustments there though. if you set the colour channels to their neutral position, which maximises contrast, with that I measured 3100 to 1. So this is a good experience. It's well beyond what non-VA LCDs would provide, without any sort of fancy local dimming, which technically wouldn't really be static contrast you're looking at there. It's a little bit cheaty, so to speak. So this is just your normal static contrast, nice performance here. And that means that for games like this, and just quite a few scenes in general, dark shades have a bit more depth to them. And this can help give a more 3D, more defined look to things as well, because there are lots of little intermingling dark shades in many scenes, shadow details, that kind of thing. And this can help the main objects just stand out a little bit more. And also where there are just big masses of darker shade like there are here, can help give a more atmospheric look, as I like to call it, deep and atmospheric. It isn't like an OLED model in this respect though, especially if you're sitting in a dark room, as I am now. You won't notice the same kind of absolute depth and inkiness and pure black look that you'll see there. And of course it depends on the game. I say pure black, but actually when you're looking at this game under SDR, you might notice that the black point, even when you look at OLED's, raised a little bit. That's just because of how the game is done, under SDR at least. But either way, it's not as deep as that. It does have a bit of VA glow as well. You can see that towards the edges of the screen. It's mainly something you'll observe lower down. It depends on your eye position. The camera's picking it up a bit more towards the top of the screen than I would see to my eye usually as well, or that you'd see to your eye from a normal ergonomically correct viewing position, but it definitely is something that you can notice towards the bottom of the screen. Not an extreme amount of VA glow. This isn't like IPS glow either. It isn't as strong and intense, the bloom there. It doesn't lighten the shades up as much. It doesn't eat into the screen as much either. And it does eat away at the atmosphere a bit, but again, it's nothing like IPS glow, and even with this, the atmosphere here is much better than competing non-VA models would provide. I've now brightened the room up so it's not pitch black anymore. It's not a super bright room, moderately bright, bit of natural daylight. You will see some glare towards the right side of the screen in particular, just because of my current lighting conditions. But I really just wanted to show you that it does take the edge off that VA glow. I can still see it a little bit to my eye, but it's much less noticeable than it was in a pitch black room. And really your gap between this and OLEDs even does sort of narrow a lot more in these kind of lighting conditions. You don't really notice the weaknesses so readily, and the relative strengths of the OLEDs also less apparent, so things sort of equalize a bit more. And even in this kind of condition, so moderately bright, not super bright, if you compare to an IPS model, you can actually notice with the IPS model a bit worse depth for the dark shades as well, even in this kind of lighting. So you don't have to be sitting in a pitch black room to appreciate the contrast of this one. There's also a bit of that black crush going on. Again, not an extreme amount, but I look at the little details like some of the darker patches on these skulls here. When they're shown towards the center of the screen, there's a bit less detail than there should be. A bit further out, they look correct. And even further out, say towards the bottom of the screen and the extreme side edges, there's actually a bit of extra unintended detail. Perhaps a better example would be the rock texture up here. Towards the central region of the screen it is more blended, towards the bottom in particular, a bit of extra detail. And actually there's a little bit of excess detail, but it's not too bad on this model. A bit of excess detail just at the very bottom and the extreme side edges from a normal viewing position, because the perceived gamma is a little bit lower than it should be. This isn't extreme again, so I've looked at a lot of video content on this model, on Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, the works. I don't notice a huge amount of excess detail. It doesn't give a sort of blocky look. I don't notice compression artifacts brought out super strongly or anything like that. Some VA models, particularly larger ones than this, they will show that a bit towards the extreme periphery of the screen, so I'm pleased to see it's not too bad in this case. I also like to talk about lighter shades when I talk about contrast, and in particular the screen surface, and I mentioned that earlier. It has a light, or perhaps relatively light, matte anti-glare screen surface, so there isn't a strong layering in front of the image, there isn't this smeary graininess to the image. It has a reasonably smooth look for a matte surface actually. It has just what I call a light misty graininess rather than anything more obvious, so this is something which most people won't really notice when they're using the monitor. Even if you're usually a bit sensitive to screen surfaces and that kind of thing, you might not find this too problematic. Yes, there are lighter screen surfaces out there, and I do talk about this a lot in my reviews where that's relevant, but what I consider competing models that directly compete with this, the full HD models, the IPS models usually have a slightly stronger screen surface, a bit more graininess than this one as well. I'm now on lagom.nl and the tests for viewing angles there, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. I like to start off with the lagom viewing angles tests because I can talk about colour consistency. So that's the shifts that can occur at different points of the screen, even just from a normal viewing position. And the lagom text test, that looks a reasonably blended grey throughout most of the screen, or at least the central mass of the screen. So there's a sort of cone that you can see, perhaps you can see this on the video as well, where it's more blended and then it becomes less blended. There's a bit of a red tint to the striping, a dark or dirty red tint to the striping a bit further out. It actually becomes green, a bit green towards the extremities of the screen. This is actually quite good for a VA model, because sometimes you see a much tighter cone where things are really blended and then it will very sharply become very colourful and less blended. That would indicate worse performance in this respect in terms of colour consistency, gamma consistency. This does still indicate moderate viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, and you're going to get some of that on any VA model. So this one is actually not too bad in that respect. For the coloured blocks, the purple block, that always looks odd on the video, I'm just going to say right now, but to my eye it is a pinkish purple throughout the screen, but it has a bit of a stronger pink tint towards the extreme side edges and also the bottom of the screen. And this pink hue does shift as you move your head, or in this case I move the camera. You can see that sort of flare out. And again, these shifts aren't too extreme. Sometimes you'll see a tight cone in the middle of the screen and very clear shifts just around that. In this case, more of a gentle saturation shift than that, but it does still have a bit of a shift. The red block appears a somewhat faded, slightly faded red throughout the screen, and it looks more faded, slightly pinkish actually towards the bottom of the screen and the extreme side edges. And again, it's a gentler shift than some VA models have, with this very tight cone and a very obvious shift, but it is still there. There still are shifts in this respect. The green block, this is a saturated yellowish green chartreuse shade throughout, a little bit of a strong yellow towards the very bottom of the screen. Again, not an extreme shift in this case. The blue block, as usual, a nice royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So overall, this monitor doesn't provide particularly vibrant colour output. It provides colour which I would describe as fairly rich and natural, a little bit muted in places, but overall more or less as the developers intend. And there are a few aspects to be aware of. There are those shifts which I described earlier using lagom, and as I said, they're not too bad for VA models. So when I look at this military green there, this dark olive green, it does, for example, look a little bit more muted towards the bottom of the screen and the side edges, but this isn't a dramatic shift. Nothing like you'd see on TN models vertically, and some VA models would show more of a shift here as well. But it does mean that shades get a bit more muted towards the peripheral regions of the screen, and it could be higher up the screen depending on your viewing position. I should also mention that if you're sitting close to the screen, these shifts become more pronounced. I tend to sit around 70 centimeters from the screen when I'm making these observations. And also the VA glow I mentioned before, that would be a bit more obvious if you're sitting closer to the screen, if you're using a higher brightness level, or if your unit has issues with strong backlight bleed and clouding, that kind of thing, that can bring it out more strongly. So I should have really mentioned that before, but I'm just adding that in here just for completeness. So the painted containers here, for example, the sky, the greens, they all look more or less as developers intend, and that's because the colour gamut of this model tracks sRGB reasonably closely. So what you're seeing there is a measured coverage of 93% sRGB, so there isn't complete coverage. You can see some under coverage in the green region, the green to blue region, but mainly concentrated in the green area. So that does mean that some green shades are a bit more muted than they should be. And I do notice that just in general when I'm looking at vegetation on games, a little bit more muted than I'd like to see or I'd expect, even with the sRGB space in mind. But this isn't hugely more muted than the developers intend. So remember that when you're viewing content like this game, or just general content on the desktop, most of the time it's going to be created with sRGB in mind, and if the monitor's gamut extends beyond that, then you get extra saturation. If it doesn't extend the full way, as it doesn't quite in this case, then you can see a bit of undersaturation. If you look at other regions of the gamut, the green to red edge, then you can see a bit of extra saturation, including in the green region. So it's a bit of a curious one that covers shades such as oranges and yellows. So The trees here are actually quite a decent example of this. They look a little bit more vibrant, slightly oversaturated actually. But again, this is quite subtle. There isn't really any extreme oversaturation on this model, just as there isn't really extreme undersaturation. So again, I would describe it largely as rich and natural. And for those who are interested, I know sometimes people like to think about even wider colour spaces. This isn't a wide gamut monitor, so that's not really applicable in this case. But just for those curious, this one has 75% DCI-P3 coverage and 72% Adobe RGB coverage. So in terms of using this monitor for colour critical work or colour sensitive work or just general work where accurate colours are desirable, I would say that the sRGB gamut isn't exactly perfect for that. The fact that there is some under coverage, so even if you calibrate this with a colorimeter, you're not going to get that coverage back. So it's not ideal in that respect. Plus the VA panel, the colour consistency issues I've mentioned with slight losses of saturation or some shades just looking a bit duller towards the bottom of the screen, the side edges, potentially the top, depending on your viewing position. It's not ideal if you want accurate and consistent colours, and I would recommend IPS alternatives for that kind of thing in general. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate. I've got this game running at 165 frames a second, so I'm maximising that, so to speak. So in terms of the benefits of this, you've got the monitor pumping out up to 2.75 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. That greatly improves the connected feel. That refers to the fluidity and the connectedness, the precision you feel when you interact with the game world. This is something which low input lag will also aid, and this monitor has fairly low input lag, not super low. I measured 4.5 milliseconds. This takes into account both the signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel, as well as an element of pixel response, which is a fair contributor on this model. So it does indicate a fairly low signal delay, fairly low input lag. Most people are going to be quite happy with this aspect of the monitor. The other aspect of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a concept explored in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness. It's also summarised a bit in the written review in the responsiveness section, so if you're not familiar with this, do check that out. I also talk about pursuit photography, which is a method to capture motion on a monitor in a way that accurately represents what the eye sees. So most of it comes from the movement of your eyes as you view a monitor, and that's very tightly linked to the refresh rate. So increasing the refresh rate helps in this respect, greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. And the other aspect is pixel responsiveness. So they're both important. So I'm going to put some pursuit photographs on the screen with this monitor running at 165Hz. You can see here that there are definitely some weaknesses in terms of its pixel responsiveness. And this is only looking at a fairly slim number of transitions. I will consider a broader range of transitions. That's why I like to show games like this as well. And I do talk about this subjectively in the written review. But just looking at these transitions, you can see some smeary trailing in places, particularly for the dark background, which is the top UFO. And you can see it a bit for the middle background, the medium shade, the medium cyan background. But there's not really any smeary trailing to speak of with the light background. You can also see the different response time settings. So there's off, normal, fast, and faster. The differences between the response time settings, they're not massive. And actually with the transitions shown here, they're not really that easy to see. But what I will tell you is that the faster setting gives you a lot of overshoot, really bright, eye-catching halo trailing. For some transitions not shown here, this is really in your face, and I hate the setting for that reason. I really can't bear to use it. I'm fairly sensitive to overshoot, but even if you weren't particularly sensitive to it, I think you'd find this quite annoying. So you'd probably want to use one of the other settings. And fast and normal, they're really quite similar. It's just that normal tends towards slightly lower overshoot, but with some pixel transitions performed a bit slower. Fast speeds up those pixel transitions, so reduces your conventional trailing a little bit, whilst increasing overshoot just slightly. These are really marginal differences in my opinion, but I prefer the overall balance with the fast setting, so that's what I've settled on here, what I'm going to be using. Also, if you notice the last and the second last column of this test, you'll see that there were some reference screens. The first one is a VA reference, that is the AOC CQ32G3SU, which is a reasonably fast VA model, not particularly fast, but I'd say it's actually slightly above average. And if you compare to that, you'll see that if anything, the VA reference screen there is slightly faster than this LG for these particular transitions, except for the light background where it's slightly slower. And that's just a theme when you look at the transitions more generally, that there are some transitions that this LG will perform a little bit faster, some that it'll perform a little bit slower. But the overall experience, I'd say, between the two models is quite similar when it comes to pixel responsiveness. There's also an IPS reference right at the end there, the AOC 24GQ50F-B, and this is just significantly faster and consistently faster. For the transition shown here, and just more broadly, it is a faster model. So I don't want you to become too downtrodden by the fact there are weaknesses here. There are weaknesses with all VA models, even the very fastest ones. The Samsung Odyssey G7 and above still have some slight weaknesses, but they are certainly more minor on those high-end Odyssey models. But many VA models, if you look at budget models like this, most of them are actually slower. And if you look at models which are a bit more expensive than this LG, quite a lot of them are actually slower as well. So the LG does push things quite well with its fast setting in terms of reducing some of this smeary trailing. And really just, there's sort of a mask of extra perceived blur when I move around here. For example, there are mainly light to medium shades, but there's certainly darker shades mixed in, quite a lot of shadow detail going on even in this scene. And again, there's that extra mask of perceived blur because of what I describe as powdery trailing, which can be a bit of a heavy powdery trail in places. It does add to perceived blur overall. But with some VA models, I'd move around here, and the dark brickwork with the medium shades in the background and some of the lighter shades in the background, there would actually be more pronounced smears that would really extend like a kind of smoky trail on some VA models, but you don't get that on this one. Slightly smeary look to the white text and the white icon there with the darker shades or the medium to dark shades in the background. Again, it's not super smeary, but there's a bit of a powdery trail. I call it a heavy powdery trail here. It also has a slightly green quality to it. If you change the color temperature of the monitor or you have it set up differently, that can change the colors that you might see here, the sort of tints to these trails. Can change that a little bit. But overall, not super colourful here, just a little bit of that powdery trailing going on. In terms of overshoot, it isn't extreme at 165 Hz. There is a bit behind the wall here with the sky in the background. It's probably not going to come across on the video because it isn't extreme overshoot. But it's a little bit brighter than the background, so it stands out a bit for that reason. Also around the tree trunk, perhaps a little bit clearer around the tree trunk to my eye at least. And again, this can have a little bit of a colourful appearance to it, slightly green or cyan in places. Depends on the transitions being performed, but it's not bright, colourful overshoot like some VA models will show. And this isn't really overshoot so much as a little bit of a, I wouldn't really say smeary, but sort of a heavy powdery trail around the post there. Might not necessarily be able to see that on the video because it isn't a defined smeary trail or anything like that. And the sweat starts pouring down their faces if they've seen my videos before. Yes, the horrible, horrible, horrible transitions with smear all over the place. Now, it's not actually that bad, but this scene does have a lot of dark transitions, dark shades, so transitions involving these darker shades, and these are transitions which VA models like this do struggle with. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are weaknesses. Some smeary trailing around the flags there. The boats down there, the canoes. A bit of smeary trailing, not too bad actually. Sometimes when I circle the mouse like this, I know some people think, oh, this is such an artificial movement. You're not going to be playing the game and doing that kind of thing. Perhaps not, but actually I'm just trying to show these particular weaknesses. You can see them to the eye with linear movements as well. It just comes across in a more obvious way on the video when I circle like this. But sometimes it really has a smoky appearance and it extends really far from the canoe here. This definitely does look smeary, but it isn't as bold or as extensive as on some VA models. So yeah, definitely weaknesses which are highlighted here. The makeshift roof is a good one for highlighting these as well. And also a little bit of a sort of muddy green colour coming out here as well. And again, the actual colour you would see, it depends on the transitions being performed, the exact shades in the background and for the object. And also it depends on how you've got the monitor set up in terms of its colour balance. So mine is targeted to 6500K white point. If you have it set to a cooler point than that, you might not notice this muddy green so much. It might be a bit more blended, but It isn't an extreme tint anyway, just something I like to point out. Another thing I like to point out is that on some VA models, these weaknesses aren't always defined smeary trails, and if I look at this bush here, it's a conglomeration of shades with dark shades and sort of medium dark shades or slightly brighter shades mixed in, and when I move, the brighter shades darken up a bit, and when I cease the movement, they return to their correct state. They brighten up. So this can appear as a sort of flickering, depending on the movement patterns in the game or with your mouse or your controller. This isn't a super defined shift in this case. It doesn't become way darker during movement and then brighten up loads. So it doesn't really look like a defined flickering effect in this case. So it's not a supreme weakness, but it does happen a little bit. And to help explore these weaknesses in a slightly more specific way, I'm going to be using good old Twitter on the desktop. So I'm just going to be giving some desktop examples. I know that not everyone will game on their monitor all the time. I spend a lot of my time not gaming as well as a bit of time gaming, mixed use. So we will see some weaknesses on the desktop as well. For dark text against a bright background, plenty of content like that on the internet, there aren't really any distinct weaknesses. Some powdery trailing in places, particularly around the images, but that's really a mixture of shades, not just pure black. But nothing that really stands out in a super obvious, annoying way, in my opinion. So for this kind of content, it's fine. With the lights out mode now, the weaknesses are more defined. So you've got a dark background, light text, but nothing that I really describe as an obvious smeary trail here. And as you move the mouse, you will see this light grey text, or you can see, when you scroll, or if you move the window, you can see this light grey text there blend into the black, a bit like I was showing you with that bush with the flickering effect. With the middle setting, which is called dim, that's where more distinct weaknesses occur, and there is smeary trailing in places. If I just start moving the window like this, it might become a bit more apparent. But around the image there, around my logo, around the text, yep, there is a smeary trail. Not super extended, not super bold, but it is there, around the icons there as well. Hopefully will come across on the video, not always easy to show, but I'm just pointing out that when you're on the desktop, you can also notice some of these weaknesses. This monitor does support VRR, it has a variable refresh rate, adaptive sync is used, that includes AMD FreeSync Premium as an AMD user, and you can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode with a compatible NVIDIA GPU, that's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 plugged in at the moment, and the experience was very similar that I tested with my NVIDIA GPU and also my AMD GPU using AMD FreeSync Premium. Very similar experience in both cases. Something I'm very pleased to note is that there isn't really an issue with VRR flickering on this model. Usually VA models will have some kind of issue here, and I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because it isn't an issue here, but I've got a thread on my forum talking a bit more about this, and it's certainly something I raise when it is an issue, and actually some OLED models have an issue with it as well. So I was really pleased to see that it isn't an issue here. It's sort of very minor flickering with very heavy fluctuations in frame rate, but there's nothing which really jumps out at you. And even when it passes the LFC boundary, low frame rate compensation, there isn't a defined flickering. So this monitor has, they will claim a 48 to 165 Hz VRR range, but in my testing it's more like 55 Hz to 165 Hz. So when it goes below that 55 Hz or thereabouts, LFC kicks in, so it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So say your game is running at 40 frames a second, it's not going to go to 40 Hz because that's below the floor of operation, but it can go to 80 Hz, which is a multiple, and that will keep tearing and stuttering at bay. So yes, the technology does work very well to keep tearing and stuttering at bay from these frame and refresh rate mismatches. Oh, and just to quickly mention, when you pass the LFC boundary, so around 55 Hz in my testing in either direction, there isn't flickering, or isn't really noticeable flickering, but you do get some stuttering, slight stuttering, and that's something which isn't specific to this model, but something which I observe much more broadly, and it isn't as obvious as the stuttering you'd get from normal frame and refresh rate mismatches, but it's something to be aware of if you are particularly sensitive to that and you're frequently passing the boundary. I've got the monitor running now at 120 Hz, so my game's running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is at 120 Hz. The trailing behaviour's changed now. So, as I mentioned, the pixel response requirements are reduced now with this reduced refresh rate. The powdery trailing is reduced. It is still there in places, and yes, you can see it around the boat, so I can certainly see it around the boat to my eye a bit, and around the flag there, a bit of a smeary trail, and just the general perceived blur. There's a little bit of a mask of extra perceived blur, but not as pronounced as it was at 165 Hz. But there's also an increase in overshoot, so you might be able to see that on the video even, sort of slightly colourful halo trailing, so that's brighter than the background and stands out a bit for that reason. So sort of a mix of this smeary trailing in places with some overshoot in places. So I wouldn't say it's ideal if you're sensitive to this kind of thing, but it's not terrible for VA at all at this kind of refresh rate. With some models, and quite often actually, there will be more pronounced smeary trails. So it works reasonably well, I'd say, at 120 Hz. Not perfect though. IPS, reference IPS model I showed you, that's not even a particularly fast IPS model actually, but even that does offer you a superior performance here. And when I say it's not particularly fast, I should say it's not slow, it's just that it isn't the fastest out there. And I used it as a reference for that reason, because it's at a level which most are very comfortable with. So some people will be happy to game with these weaknesses. Other people, they'll find them a bit annoying. I've now got the game running at 100 frames a second, so the monitor's running at 100 Hz. The overshoot does become more pronounced now. There is, I find it quite eye-catching actually, even when I'm not specifically looking for it. Even compared to 120 Hz, I do feel it's sort of moderately strong now. If you want to reduce this, you might think, well, I could change to the normal overdrive setting. So I've just switched over to the normal response time setting, and that does reduce it a little bit, but to be honest, it's still almost as eye-catching. Doesn't really make a huge difference, and there's a slight increase in the powdery trailing as well in places, but not really too much. Actually, really the two settings give you a very similar performance. So if you find it bothersome on one, you're going to find it bothersome with the other setting. You can eliminate it by switching the response time to off. So goodbye overshoot, but hello extreme smeary trailing. And I should actually mention at this point that some VA models will always look like this, or roughly like this, even with a strong overdrive setting. So to put things in perspective, this monitor is actually quite decent for a VA panel, but there are still weaknesses to be aware of, and this offsetting is almost making me feel a bit sick. It's like this sort of extra filter on the game to simulate drunkenness or something like that. It's not wonderful. To be honest, I would take a bit of overshoot over this personally. I've now got things running at 80 Hz, 80 frames a second, and I'm still using the offsetting, and even at 80 frames a second, there are really distinct weaknesses, even though the pixel response requirements are much lower now than they were at 165 Hz, for example, and significantly lower even compared to 120 Hz. And yeah, it just isn't keeping up at all with the requirements here. A lot of smeary trailing all over the place. Not nice, so I'm going to switch over to my preferred fast setting. I'm not going to bother showing you normal because it's very similar to fast. So now there is quite a lot of overshoot, and you might even be conflicted between using that off setting, which wasn't really very nice because of the smeary trailing all over the place, and this fast setting, which largely eliminates the smeary trailing. There's not really anything I would describe as smeary. There is actually a little bit for the wood there with the dark shades or medium dark shades in the background, a bit of that going on, but it's really the overshoot which is the more obvious issue here. So what I would have liked to have seen is normal being a setting which is somewhere between off and fast, rather than it being really very close to fast. To really sort of complete this and hammer this home, I've now got the game running at 60 frames a second, 60 Hz, super bright halo trailing. It's going to be very obvious on the video, I would hope, around the makeshift roof, for example. And I'm just going to switch to the normal setting. just to show you that it's still there in pretty much all its glory. And then the off setting for completeness. You guessed it, smeary trailing all over the place, but the overshoot has gone. But there's nothing between these two extremes. And if you are spending a lot of time in these double digits and you're really conflicted between the off setting and the normal or fast setting, I completely understand that, because these two extremes, neither of them are particularly great. Then you might even want to just disable VRR and put up with the tearing and stuttering. It's not ideal, and it's a shame that users have to really choose between these two. But really this monitor seems to be quite heavily optimized for the much higher refresh rates, and less optimization, less thought given to the lower refresh rates. If you're rarely here, rarely in these double digit refresh rates, or rarely 100 Hz or below, or really much below 120 Hz, then just stick to fast, be happy. Yes, there are some weaknesses and all that, but I think the offsetting is much worse. Whereas down here, there's a bit of a conflict between which setting to use, and nothing is really anywhere close to perfect. Speaking of not close to perfect, the monitor also includes a strobe backlight setting called 1 millisecond motion blur reduction. That is something which is explored in the Vision review in quite a bit of detail, probably more detail than I really had to, because I didn't like the setting in this case, because there was a lot of strobe crosstalk. There's some distinct weaknesses due to some pixel response time weaknesses causing obvious fragments of trailing, and for that reason it didn't really deliver the kind of experience I'd hoped to see from a strobe backlight setting. Even if you quite like to use this kind of setting usually, I'm not sure if you will on this model. To wrap up then, the monitor is very limited in terms of ergonomics, tilt-only stand, although it does have VESA holes at the back if you want to use them, 75 by 75mm VESA. Basic design, no overly fussy gamery elements, fairly robust feel actually for a budget monitor. The screen is held quite firmly in place on the stand, so that was nice to see, or nice to feel, should I say. In terms of the contrast performance, that was the main strength of this model. It performs within spec. Has a bit of VA glow, but not a huge amount. A bit of black crush, again, not a huge amount of that either, but it's a factor still. But it's static contrast around 3000 to 1, a little bit high, a little bit lower, depending on the settings you use. Gives a good performance in that respect, good atmospheric look in dark conditions. For the colour performance, the monitor doesn't fully cover sRGB. There's some under coverage as well as a bit of over coverage in some regions. So it delivers what I describe as a fairly rich and natural look. A little bit muted in places. If you're interested in a more focused look at this, I would recommend checking out the Spider Checker 24 section of the Vision review, because there are really some nice visual examples there of what I'm talking about, which will be shown in a more controlled way than I can show you in the video. And there are some losses of saturation and some shades looking a little bit duller than ideal towards the bottom of the screen and the extreme side edges, but these shifts were not extreme for a VA model. So not a bad performance in that respect, but not up to the likes of your IPS alternatives either. For responsiveness, I wouldn't say that the monitor, again, was up to the IPS alternatives. Quite clearly isn't. There are some distinct weaknesses, some smeary trailing in places, heavy powdery trailing, overshoot, depends on the transitions you're looking at. It's not bad either for a VA model. I would say it's above average overall in terms of its responsiveness for a VA panel. It's going to be at a level which some people are going to be perfectly happy to use, and even if they have used VA panels in the past, particularly budget VA models, and they've found them a bit problematic, this one might be okay for them. But there are some weaknesses which could bother some people, and I was certainly noticing them sort of left, right and centre when I was reviewing this model. But still, praise where praise is due. Decent tuning by LG for the high refresh rates, I'd say. The lower refresh rates, I was less impressed with the pixel response tuning. There's really not a perfect solution when you're in the double digits. There's either too much overshoot or too much smeary trailing. The normal setting, which is between fast and off, should have been optimized in a way where it sits really between those two more distinctly, rather than sitting very close to fast, but just a little bit slower. Anyway, enough grumbling. The VRR does work. It works as intended on my AMD system, my AMD GPU, and my NVIDIA GPU. I was also pleased to see that there wasn't a lot of VRR flickering, really just minor flickering for extreme fluctuations, a lot less than I'd usually see on VA models, so that was actually very nice to see. The input lag as well wasn't an issue. It wasn't super low, but it was still what I would classify broadly as low, so it shouldn't be an issue for most people. So overall, it's not a model I can outright recommend because it does have some weaknesses which, I'm personally sensitive to things. Monitors are subjective. These are things which sort of bother me enough to not just outright recommend the monitor. Then again, if you are one of those people who really likes VA models, you know that VA panels are for you, you want the strong contrast, and you're willing to make some sacrifices elsewhere, but you still want reasonable responsiveness, particularly in the triple digits for your refresh rate, then I'd say give this one a go. You might well really like it. So that's really all there is to the LG 24GQ50F or 24GQ50F-B for being more complete. Be sure to check out the full written review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. And also, if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That's a nice way of showing your support.